The crossing gate is down. The lights are flashing. The horn has sounded 3 times. And Darlene Whitmore is still standing there, sun visor, clipboard, arms crossed, blocking an active federal railroad crossing like she owns it. She's the HOA president of Ridgeline Pines. She's fined black families for basketball hoops while her friends park unlicensed vans on the street. She's drained the community fund for her own legal battles. She's made 11 years of my life miserable. And this morning she decided a 60-ton freight train needed her permission to pass through her neighborhood. She stood there for 5 minutes, then the cab door opened, and she realized, too late, exactly who was driving that train. What would you do if your HOA president tried to block a freight train? Drop it in the comments. And where are you watching from tonight? I want to take you back 11 years, because to understand what happened on that Tuesday morning in October, you need to understand what Ridgeline Pines actually is. It's a tight cluster of about 200 homes tucked along the western edge of Harwick County, Tennessee. The kind of neighborhood where the houses are close enough that you can hear your neighbor frying bacon, and far enough apart that you mostly pretend you can't. When I moved in with my wife, Carolyn, and our 2 kids, the place felt like a quiet deal. Modest HOA fees, a community pool that smelled faintly of sunscreen and chlorine, a gravel walking path that wound past the edge of our property and crossed over the old Burlington Northern spur line that runs through the hollow. That spur line was there before any of these houses, before the HOA, before Ridgeline Pines had a name. The crossing is a public right-of-way established in 1947, granted to Harwick County in perpetuity. That fact is going to matter a great deal. Now, I need to tell you about my job. For 22 years I've worked for Meridian Freight Rail, a regional carrier that hauls aggregate, timber, and industrial goods through 5 counties. For the last 9 of those years, I've been a certified locomotive engineer. Early mornings, late nights, the particular meditative quality of watching Tennessee countryside unspool ahead of you at 35 miles an hour. I love the work. It smells of diesel and hot metal, and something vaguely electrical that you can never quite name. The cab vibrates under you like a low, steady hum. Not unpleasant, more like something alive beneath your boots. The spur line that passes through Ridgeline Pines? That's part of my Tuesday run. Now, Darlene Whitmore. Darlene moved into the neighborhood about 6 years ago and became HOA board president within 18 months. She is the kind of person who reads the bylaws the way a medieval scholar reads scripture, looking not for spirit, but for ammunition. She has a gift for identifying the precise intersection of petty power and plausible deniability. She once fined the Okafor family for having a basketball hoop in their driveway, a temporary, portable one, citing a bylaw about permanent sports apparatus. She fined the Reinhardts for a wind chime, an actual wind chime. But here's the thing about Darlene. She didn't apply the rules equally. The Okafor family, who had moved in about 4 years earlier, a black family, 2 kids, the nicest people on the street, got fines that arrived like clockwork. Meanwhile, Darlene's friend Patsy had an actual unpermitted garden shed in her backyard, and somehow the board never noticed. I noticed. Several people noticed. Nobody felt like they had the standing, or the energy, or the legal budget to fight it. The first unfair act that directly involved me came 18 months before the Locomotive confrontation. Our house backs up to a strip of community green space that runs along the rail corridor. I'd put in a raised garden bed, completely within my property line, verified by the county assessor's plat map. Darlene sent a violation notice claiming the bed was on common property. It wasn't. I sent back a copy of the plat. She sent another notice. I went to a board meeting. She moved the goalposts. Now the issue was that the garden bed was an eyesore visible from the walking path, which, as a grounds aesthetic issue, the board had discretionary authority to flag. That's the moment I knew I was dealing with someone who didn't want to win specific arguments. She wanted to win everything, forever, by making the cost of opposition too high to bear. I started keeping records that night. Here's a thing about living next to a freight corridor that most people don't think about. The crossing schedule is published. Meridian Freight Rail files its run sheets with Harwick County Transportation Authority every quarter. It's public record. The Tuesday morning run, my run, crosses the Ridgeline Pines spur crossing at approximately 7:14 a.m., give or take 10 minutes depending on yard conditions. Every Tuesday for 9 years. The crossing is gated, The warning lights work. The horn protocol is federally mandated. You hear the horn. You stop. The train passes. 30 seconds, maybe 40. Life continues. Or it always had. About 10 months before the big day, Darlene began her first campaign against the crossing. She circulated a petition among residents, claiming the train was a noise and safety nuisance that was impeding neighborhood ingress and egress. The petition gathered 43 signatures out of 200 households, roughly 20%, which she presented to the county commissioner's office as evidence of a community groundswell. She also filed a formal complaint with the State Transportation Board, arguing that the crossing violated some vague provision about residential density thresholds near active rail corridors. This is a technique that I'd later learn has a name in HOA legal circles: complaint stacking, filing multiple low-cost complaints with multiple agencies simultaneously, betting that at least one will generate enough bureaucratic friction to slow the opponent down. None of her complaints had merit, but each one required a formal response. Meridian's operations coordinator, a methodical woman named Faye Doherty, spent 11 hours preparing documentation to refute claims that took Darlene maybe 45 minutes to invent. I was still just watching from the outside at this point. Frustrated, yes, but watching. Then Darlene escalated in a way that made it personal. She went to the HOA annual meeting in March, a meeting I couldn't attend because I was on a 5 a.m. run, and pushed through an amendment to the community covenants. The amendment designated the strip of common green space along the rail corridor as a quiet zone amenity area, which, per the new covenant language, could not be subject to commercial or industrial audio disturbance. The amendment passed 12-4 among the board members present, with the quorum barely met and no notice sent to residents about the specific language being voted on. Under normal circumstances, this would be a completely toothless document. The HOA doesn't own the rail corridor. They don't own the crossing. A covenant about noise in common areas doesn't supersede federal rail law. But toothless documents, wielded by someone with a clipboard and a confident voice, can do real damage in the meanwhile. The following Tuesday, Darlene stationed herself at the crossing at 7:05 a.m. with a handheld camera and a laminated card citing the new covenant. She wasn't blocking the crossing, not yet. She was just there, filming the train as it passed, collecting what she would later describe to neighbors as evidence of ongoing HOA covenant violations. She put together a slickly formatted newsletter that went to all 200 homes, with a photograph of the locomotive, my locomotive, and a headline reading, "Your HOA is fighting for your quiet mornings." I want to take a moment to acknowledge the craftsmanship here. Darlene knew she couldn't stop the train. She wasn't trying to. Not yet. She was building a narrative. She was making the crossing feel like a problem she, personally, was heroically battling. She was the protagonist of a story that she was writing specifically to make me into the villain. The smell of diesel in the morning had, apparently, become an affront to civilized life. I did two things. First, I contacted Meridian's legal department and gave them a full written briefing on the HOA's complaint stacking campaign and the new covenant amendment. Their attorney, a compact, unsmiling man named Gerald Thorne, sent Darlene a letter in about 10 days, politely noting that federal rail regulations preempt local and private agreements, and that Meridian reserved all rights to operate its licensed corridor. Gerald's letter was 7 paragraphs. It used the phrase, "without limitation," 4 times. Gerald is excellent at his job. Second, and this is the one that mattered for later, I filed a public records request with Harwick County for every document related to the Ridgeline Pines rail crossing going back to 1940. Property records, easement filings, right-of-way grants, plat maps, correspondence. The box of documents arrived 3 weeks later. I read every page. There, on page 41 of a 1952 county annexation record, was something that made me sit back in my chair and stare at the ceiling for a long minute. But I'll get to that. I want to describe the weeks that followed the newsletter because they had a texture to them, a specific, grinding quality like gravel under a boot heel that is hard to convey without the details. Darlene's newsletter worked. Not on everyone, but on enough people. The Moreau family, nice folks, 2 houses down from me, had a new baby and were legitimately sensitive to noise, started giving me strange smiles at the mailbox. A guy named Bert Kincaid, who I'd shared beers with at the 4th of July block party 3 summers running, stopped making eye contact. The narrative was doing its job. I was the guy who drove the noisy train through their neighborhood. I was a problem to be solved. Meanwhile, Darlene upgraded her complaint stacking strategy. She filed with the EPA, noise pollution. She filed with the Federal Railroad Administration, claiming, falsely, with no evidence, that the crossing gates were not functioning correctly. Each filing required a response. Meridian's legal costs were ticking upward. Gerald Thorne's response to the FRA filing was measured and thorough, but he did say something to me that I wrote down word for word. "Mr. Van, the other side isn't trying to win in regulatory venues. They're trying to make the cost of winning too high for you to bother. Don't let them." Corbin Van, that's me. I should have introduced myself earlier. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. I like mechanical systems, cold coffee, and the particular silence of a rail yard at 4 a.m. when the mist sits low and the only sound is the distant clank of a coupling. I had no interest in a public fight, but I also had 11 years of careful record-keeping on my side, a box of county documents, and something I'd found on page 41 that Darlene did not know I had. I kept that card in my pocket. What I did instead was start attending HOA board meetings. The first one I showed up to, Darlene almost visibly recalibrated. She'd been expecting me to absorb pressure from a distance. My presence changed the dynamic. I didn't say much at that first meeting. I introduced myself, noted that I was a resident of 11 years, and asked that any rail-related agenda items be sent to me in advance, per the open meeting provisions of the HOA's own bylaws. She couldn't refuse that. The bylaws were specific. But she did try. The meeting minutes from that session, which I later obtained under the HOA's own document access provision, show that Darlene moved to have standing rail operations concerns, classified as an executive session item, which would have allowed the board to discuss them without my presence. The motion failed 3-2. 2 board members, Theron Jacobs and a quiet woman named Ruth Ann Pickett, voted against it. I made a point of thanking them after the meeting. Darlene's response to my attendance was to escalate in a direction I hadn't anticipated. She started going after my property directly. A fine for a fence post she claimed was 2 inches over the property line. It wasn't. I had the survey. A fine for an outdoor storage container in my side yard. She cited a bylaw, but the bylaw had been amended 2 years prior, and the amended version permitted the container. I appealed both fines through the HOA's own dispute process, submitted the documentation, and had them reversed in writing. Each reversal was a small victory, but small victories were not enough, because Darlene was also working on something bigger. She'd hired a private attorney, not a cheap one, and was preparing to formally petition the county to reclassify the rail easement as inactive and abandoned, which, under Tennessee Code Annotated Section 54-5-107, would allow the county to extinguish the easement and return the corridor to adjacent landowners. Let me translate that. If she succeeded, the legal basis for the crossing's existence would evaporate. Meridian would be forced to either reroute the Tuesday run, at enormous cost, or cease the spur line operations entirely. The petition was scheduled to be heard in 4 months. And here's where I pulled out page 41. The 1952 county annexation record contained a covenant, not an HOA covenant, a county covenant, recorded in the deed chain, that explicitly bound the Ridgeline Pines development to a perpetual, irrevocable access easement for rail operations along the spur corridor. Not just the crossing, the entire corridor. And the covenant included a specific clause. Any attempt by a successor interest, including a homeowners association, to petition for easement reclassification would constitute a material breach, triggering a $250,000 liquidated damages provision payable to the County Transportation Authority. Darlene's attorney's petition, if filed, would cost the HOA $250,000. But I waited. I didn't reveal it yet. 2 months before the county hearing, Darlene made the move I'd been half expecting and half dreading. She called a special HOA meeting and proposed a special assessment. A special assessment, for those who haven't had the pleasure, is when an HOA board decides that the regular monthly dues aren't sufficient and levies an additional one-time charge on all homeowners. They can be legitimate. A parking lot needs repaving, a clubhouse roof is failing. They can also be weaponized. Darlene's proposed assessment was for $18,000, her attorney's fees for the easement reclassification petition. She was asking all 200 households to collectively fund her legal campaign against the crossing. Split across the community, it worked out to $90 per household. Modest enough that most people wouldn't fight it. Significant enough that, aggregated, it would fully bankroll the petition. Here's the thing about HOA special assessments that most homeowners don't know. They are generally subject to a membership vote if they exceed a threshold specified in the governing documents. I had read Ridgeline Pines CC and R's cover to cover by this point, twice, with a yellow highlighter. The threshold in our documents was $15,000. Anything above that required a 2/3 vote of the full membership, not just the board. Darlene was proposing $18,000 and planning to pass it with a board vote. I raised my hand at the special meeting and cited the relevant provision. Section 9.4b. Darlene told me I was misreading the bylaws. I had brought a printed copy. I showed her. The room went quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone realizes they've made a mistake in public. The board tabled the assessment pending legal review. Their own attorney confirmed, 4 days later, that Section 9.4b applied. The assessment would require a membership vote. Darlene repackaged it at $14,800. The board passed it 4-1. Theron Jacobs was the dissenting vote. Ruth Ann Pickett, I was disappointed to see, went along with it. $94 per household, just under the threshold. I appealed the assessment through the HOA dispute process on the grounds that it constituted a use of HOA funds for private legal action that did not benefit the community as a whole, which is, in many states, a breach of fiduciary duty by board members. I filed that appeal with documentation and a formal request for arbitration under the dispute resolution clause in Section 12 of the CC&RS. Darlene responded by filing a counter-complaint against me for disruptive conduct at board meetings. She also, and this is the part that started keeping me up at night, began a quiet campaign to recruit proxies. She needed to win a vote, if it came to that. She spent 3 weeks going door to door, delivering homemade banana bread and a printed summary of why the train was a health hazard. The summary included a statistic about rail corridor noise and childhood sleep disruption that I later traced to a study conducted in an urban freight corridor context that bore absolutely no resemblance to a single weekly spur run through a quiet Tennessee hollow. But banana bread is persuasive. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. I countered with something different. I wrote a letter, not a newsletter, a personal letter, signed by me, and hand-delivered it to every household in Ridgeline Pines that I could reach. The letter did not attack Darlene. It laid out, simply and specifically, what the easement reclassification would actually cost the community. Not just the assessment, but the potential $250,000 liquidated damages clause I'd found, which I now, for the first time, disclosed. I included a copy of the relevant 1952 document as an exhibit. I made clear that I was not a lawyer, that I recommended everyone seek their own counsel, and that I simply wanted my neighbors to have the full picture before any vote. I don't know how many people read it carefully. I know that within 48 hours, I had received 11 text messages from neighbors I'd barely spoken to in years. Some supportive, some angry, some just confused. One was from Ruth Ann Pickett. It said, "Can you come by this week? I have some questions." The next board meeting was scheduled in 6 days. Darlene had placed the easement petition on the agenda as a formal action item. She was planning to make it a done deal before anyone had time to think. I had 5 days to make sure that didn't happen, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I was already thinking about Tuesday. Ruth Ann Pickett's living room smelled like lavender and old paperback spines. She had a pot of coffee on the counter and 2 printed pages on her kitchen table when I arrived. One of them was my letter. The other was a document I hadn't seen before. "Corbin," she said, sliding it across to me. "Did you know about this?" It was a copy of Ridgeline Pines HOA's most recent financial audit. Not the summary that got distributed to residents, the full audit, which Ruth Ann had requested in her capacity as a board member under Tennessee nonprofit corporation law. She'd never read it carefully until my letter prompted her to look harder. I read it while she refilled my coffee. The HOA had a maintenance reserve fund, a standard account that associations use for long-term capital expenses. Ours was supposed to hold around $140,000, based on the reserve study conducted 3 years prior. The audit showed a current balance of $31,400. Over $108,000 had been dispersed in 18 months. The disbursements were categorized under legal and professional services. There was no itemization in the summary audit. The full audit had a reference code for a supplemental ledger. Ruth Ann had also pulled the ledger. The payments went to 2 vendors. The first was a law firm, Darlene's attorney's firm. The second was a consulting company called Crestline HOA Management Solutions, LLC. I looked up Crestline HOA Management Solutions on my phone right there at Ruth Ann's table. It took me 11 minutes to find what I was looking for. Crestline was a Tennessee LLC, registered in 2021. Its registered agent was a woman named Patricia Ann Whitmore, Patsy, Darlene's friend Patsy, the one with the unpermitted garden shed. The HOA had been paying Crestline, which appears to be wholly controlled by Darlene's personal associate, $4,200 a month for management consultation services. The contract had been approved by the board in a session where Darlene presided and voted in favor. Under the HOA's bylaws, board members are required to disclose conflicts of interest and recuse from related votes. There was no disclosure in the minutes, no recusal. This is what's known in HOA law as self-dealing, a board member directing association funds to an entity in which she has a personal or financial interest. In Tennessee, under the Nonprofit Corporation Act, it exposes board members to personal liability and can constitute grounds for removal. If the relationship between Darlene and Patsy's company is what it appeared to be, every dollar paid to Crestline was potentially recoverable. $75,600, 18 months, $4,200 a month. The Maintenance Reserve Fund, the money that was supposed to protect every homeowner's property value, had been quietly drained to fund Darlene's agenda and, quite possibly, her friend's bank account. Ruth Ann's hands were steady on her coffee cup. She was a retired bookkeeper. She'd seen this kind of thing before, she said. She just hadn't expected to see it here. I took photographs of every page. Then, I called Gerald Thorne at Meridian's legal department and asked him to recommend a nonprofit law specialist in Harwick County. He gave me a name in 40 minutes, an attorney named Priscilla Favre, who spent about half her practice on HOA governance disputes and the other half on estate litigation. I called Priscilla that same afternoon. She had availability Thursday. We had 4 days before Darlene's board meeting. Time to stop playing defense. Thursday morning I was in Priscilla Favre's office by 8. The place was all clean oak furniture and afternoon light, and she had the kind of focused energy that made you feel like the problem was already halfway solved. She read through my documents while I sat across from her and drank yet more coffee. I was getting through about 6 cups a day at this point. My hands smelled permanently of coffee and old paper. She looked up after about 20 minutes. "Okay," she said, "let's talk about what we can actually do." Here's what she laid out, and I'm going to walk you through it plainly, because understanding the mechanics is the point. The first instrument was a derivative action on behalf of the HOA. Because the HOA is a nonprofit corporation, any member, any homeowner, has standing under Tennessee law to bring a legal action on behalf of the association when the board itself has breached its fiduciary duty and won't self-correct. The self-dealing payments to Crestline were a textbook breach. Priscilla could file the derivative action, seeking disgorgement of the $75,600 and removal of the conflicted board member, Darlene, without needing a majority vote of the membership to proceed. The lawsuit would be filed in the name of the HOA, using Darlene's own negligence as the lever to pry her off the board. The one-sentence version. Darlene's secret payments to her friend's company gave us the legal tool to remove her from the board without asking anyone's permission. The second instrument was the 1952 covenant clause I'd found in the county records, the liquidated damages provision. Priscilla confirmed that it was enforceable. Better yet, she found something I'd missed. The clause also entitled the county, in the event of a breach attempt, to seek an injunction preventing the HOA from proceeding with any easement reclassification petition. This meant that the moment Darlene filed her petition with the county, we could immediately seek an emergency injunction, blocking it, and the $250,000 damages clock would start ticking. One-sentence version. If Darlene filed her petition, she would simultaneously trigger a $250,000 liability for every homeowner she'd convinced to support her. The third instrument was physical, and this one was mine. Tuesday's run. My run. The spur-line schedule that was public record, that Darlene had been citing in her campaign materials as evidence of ongoing nuisance. She'd been making the crossing famous. And I had a thought, sitting in Priscilla's office with my 6th cup of coffee. If Darlene was going to make a spectacle of that crossing, she was going to get one. She just wasn't going to control it. Meridian Freight's operations team, led by a man named Dale Schroeder, is meticulous about the Tuesday run. Dale and I had talked about the HOA situation. He'd been fielding the regulatory complaints for months. He was, to put it mildly, unsympathetic to Darlene. When I called him and described what I was thinking, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I don't see a single safety or operational reason we couldn't schedule you for that run and have you stop at the Ridgeline crossing for a standard mandatory gate check." A mandatory gate check is a real procedure. If a rail crew has any reason to visually inspect crossing gate function, a reported malfunction, an operational concern, routine protocol on a specific run, the engineer stops the train at the crossing and conducts a visual inspection. This is entirely within Meridian's operating authority. The train stops. The engineer steps out. It's all very legitimate. And if the engineer happened to step out right in the middle of a neighborhood, in front of a woman who'd spent 8 months telling everyone that train was a menace and a nuisance, well, sometimes the universe hands you a stage. Meanwhile, Ruth Ann Pickett had been quietly reaching out to the other board members. Theron Jacobs was already on our side. She'd spoken to 2 of the remaining 4. One of them, a soft-spoken man named Warren Cobb, had become deeply uncomfortable with the Crestline payments since my letter went out. He was considering his options. And one more piece of the machine. I reached out to the Harwick County Ledger, the local paper, which covers HOA disputes with more enthusiasm than you might expect. I offered their features reporter, a young woman named Meg Stratton, an exclusive. I had documentation of what appeared to be financial self-dealing by an HOA board president, a contentious easement dispute, and what I described as a Tuesday morning event that you're probably going to want to have a photographer at. Meg said she'd be there. The board meeting was Monday night. Tuesday morning, the train ran. The Monday board meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. By 6:30, the room was at capacity, something that had never happened in the 11 years I'd been a resident. Word had spread, the way word does in small communities when people sense that something is about to break open. I counted at least 60 homeowners and folding chairs. The pool and recreation committee members sat in the back, with the expressions of people who desperately wanted to be somewhere else. Darlene arrived in a blazer. She had a binder. She had a projector slide prepared on a laptop. She had, I noticed, the slightly elevated chin of someone who believes they have already won. She opened the meeting, called the roll, moved through the routine items with brisk efficiency. Then she announced that the primary agenda item was the formal vote to approve filing the easement reclassification petition with Harwick County. I raised my hand. "Point of order," I said. "Before any vote on the petition, I need to place something on the record." Darlene told me the floor was not open for comments during action items. I said, calmly, that under the HOA's own bylaws, any item with a financial impact on the association required a financial disclosure period before a vote could be taken. Section 8.3a. I had the page number. Darlene's jaw tightened. She called a 5-minute recess. During the recess, her attorney, who was present, which tells you something about how prepared she'd been for this meeting, spoke to her in a low, rapid voice in the corner. I watched them without appearing to watch them. There was a specific moment, maybe 90 seconds in, when the attorney said something and Darlene went still. The recess ended. Darlene returned to the front of the room. "The board will allow a public comment period," she said, "limited to 3 minutes. 3 minutes was all I needed." I stood up and, in front of 60 neighbors and the recording equipment that Meg Stratton had set up in the corner of the room, I walked through the 1952 covenant clause. I described the $250,000 liquidated damages provision. I showed a copy of the relevant document on my phone, held up for the room. I explained, in plain language, that the moment this petition was filed, every single homeowner in Ridgeline Pines could be exposed to shared liability for $250,000. on top of the $18,000 assessment they'd already been asked to fund. The room made a sound like a collective intake of breath. Then I raised the Crestline payments. I didn't call Darlene a thief. I didn't accuse anyone of fraud. I described, factually, what the financial ledger showed. $75,600 in payments to a company whose registered agent was Darlene's personal associate, approved in a board session where the relevant disclosure and recusal procedures had not been followed. I said that an attorney had reviewed this documentation and was prepared to file a derivative action on behalf of the HOA. I said all of this in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Darlene tried to interrupt twice. The second time, Theron Jacobs, bless him, gavel pounded her into silence and said, "Let the man finish." When I sat down, the room erupted. Not violently. This was a HOA meeting in a Tennessee suburb, not a Senate hearing, but loudly and persistently. Darlene attempted to call the vote anyway. Warren Cobb, the board member Ruth Ann had been working on, announced that he was recusing himself from the vote pending the derivative action filing. With Cobb out and Ruth Ann voting against and Theron voting against, the vote failed 3-2. Darlene adjourned the meeting. As people filed out, several neighbors stopped to shake my hand. Bert Kincaid, of the 4th of July beers and the estranged eye contact, gripped my hand for a long moment and said simply, "I'm sorry, man." The Moreau family, baby on hip, stopped to say they'd read the 1952 document and hadn't realized. Mrs. Okafor, whose family had been absorbing Darlene's enforcement campaign for years, pulled me aside and said, "Whatever you need, whatever comes next." Darlene left the building without speaking to anyone. Her attorney, collecting his briefcase, met my eyes across the room and gave me a small, precise nod. The kind professionals give each other when they both understand what's actually happening. I went home, slept badly, set my alarm for 4:15. Tuesday was coming. I want to tell you what Darlene did between 9 p.m. and 6:30 Tuesday morning, because I only found out the full picture afterward, from Ruth Ann, from Meg Stratton's reporting, and from one neighbor who had a security camera pointed at the street. At approximately 10:30 p.m. Monday, Darlene drove to the rail crossing and zip-tied a handmade sign to the crossing gate arm. The sign read, "Ridgeline Pines Residence. This crossing is under legal contest. Petition your county commissioner." Below that was a QR code linking to her attorney's website. At some point between midnight and 2 a.m., she also sent an email blast to the Ridgeline Pines community list. The email was titled, "Emergency, HOA under attack." It described the board meeting as having been disrupted by misinformation and characterized the derivative action filing as a personal lawsuit being waged against your neighborhood by one disgruntled resident. It encouraged everyone to show up at the crossing Tuesday morning in a show of community solidarity. I am not sure how many people received that email and decided to actually set an alarm and drive to a train crossing at 7 a.m. The number turned out to be 17. 17 people, some in pajamas and house slippers, standing in the gray October morning air with the particular sheepish energy of people who aren't entirely sure why they came. Also, Meg Stratton and her photographer. Also, 2 county code enforcement officers who'd been tipped off, by whom I'm not certain, but I have my suspicions it was Priscilla Favre, that an unlicensed sign had been attached to a publicly maintained crossing gate arm, which is a citationable violation of county code. Also, Darlene. She was there in the blazer again, same clipboard. At 6:50, she positioned herself at the edge of the crossing, not blocking the gate mechanism. She was too careful for that, but standing in a way that was clearly performative. She was making a statement. She was there to be seen being there. I want to be honest with you about something. In my cab that morning, on the approach to the Ridgeline Pines spur crossing, I was not experiencing triumph. I was experiencing the particular tightness in the chest that comes when you know a thing is about to be over, and you're not entirely sure you handled all of it well. 11 years is a long time. 200 families. Some of them I'd gotten wrong about, some of them had gotten me wrong. Endings are rarely as clean as you want them to be. But then I rounded the curve past the Durban Road Bridge, and I could see the crossing ahead of me, the lights cycling, the gate arm descending, and I could see the cluster of people on the far side of it, and I could see Darlene in her blazer with her clipboard, turning to look at the approaching locomotive with an expression that I can only describe as dawning. I applied the brakes at the right marker for the mandatory gate check stop. The train slowed. 60 tons of locomotive and freight, decelerating with that deep, resonant groan of steel on steel that fills the chest and vibrates the fillings in your back teeth. It smells like hot iron and brake compound and the cold morning grass on either side of the corridor. It sounds like God clearing his throat. The locomotive came to a full stop, with the cab positioned directly at the crossing. I put on my hard hat. I climbed down. The morning air hit me like cold water, sharp and damp, smelling of turned earth and diesel, and the faint sweetness of whatever the Moreaus were growing in their kitchen window boxes. I stepped off the locomotive's access ladder, and my boots hit the gravel path of the crossing, with a crunch that, in the sudden quiet after the engine idle dropped, sounded unreasonably loud. 17 residents in various states of mourning preparedness, 2 code enforcement officers, 1 reporter, 1 photographer, 1 sign zip-tied to a gate arm, and Darlene Whitmore, approximately 8 feet away from me, holding her clipboard in both hands the way you hold something when you're not sure whether you're going to need to defend yourself with it. I walked to the crossing gate arm. I removed my gloves and inspected the gate mechanism, methodically, professionally, the way you do a gate check. I logged the inspection in the tablet I carry for exactly this purpose. Gate functioning within normal parameters. Horn response confirmed. Gate arm clear of obstruction after the code enforcement officer had, about 60 seconds before I arrived, cited Darlene for the unauthorized sign and removed it. Then I turned around. "Morning," I said. 17 people looked at me. Darlene looked at me. Meg Stratton's photographer took a picture that would later appear on page 3 of the Harwick County Ledger, above the caption, "Rail engineer Corbin Van completes required gate inspection at the Ridgeline Pines Spur crossing." Darlene found her voice. "You have no right to stop this train in this crossing," she said. The clipboard was against her chest now, armor style. I explained, at conversational volume, that a mandatory gate inspection stop was within Meridian Freight Rail's standard operating protocol, that I was the certified engineer of record for this run, and that the inspection was logged and documented. I explained it nicely. I may have enjoyed explaining it more than I should have. This crossing, I continued, and here I was speaking to the 17 residents as much as to her, was established by county right-of-way in 1947. It is protected by a covenant recorded in 1952 that binds every successor interest to this development, including the HOA, from interfering with rail operations or petitioning for easement reclassification. Any attempt to file such a petition triggers $250,000 in liquidated damages payable to the county. That covenant has been on file at the Harwick County Register of Deeds for 73 years. I said this without notes. I'd been rehearsing it for 3 days. Darlene said something about my employment with Meridian being a conflict of interest. It was the wrong thing to say. One of the code enforcement officers, a patient, square-jawed man named Officer Dills, gently explained to her that a county-issued right-of-way didn't create a conflict of interest for the rail operator. It created an obligation. He also handed her a citation for the unauthorized sign. Then Meg Stratton asked if she could ask me a few questions, and I said yes, and we stood there in the October morning while she recorded on her phone, and the locomotive idled behind me with that low, meditative heartbeat. Behind Darlene, I watched something happen that I will remember for the rest of my life. Mrs. Okafor had come. She was standing at the edge of the group in her coat, with her husband, both of them watching. When Darlene turned to look at the crowd, perhaps hoping for support, the solidarity she'd emailed for, Mrs. Okafor met her eyes, just held them, calm and steady. Nobody moved toward Darlene. Nobody nodded. People just stood there in the morning air. Darlene left, not with a speech, not with a final statement. She walked to her car, which was parked on the shoulder about 40 yards back, and she drove away. The photographer got the shot. I finished my gate check documentation. I climbed back up into the cab. Dale Schroeder's voice came over the radio. "Ridgeline crossing clear?" I said. "Clear." The locomotive moved. The Tuesday run continued, same as it had for 9 years, same as it would for 9 more. The crossing lights cycled and went dark. The gate arm rose. 17 people in pajamas and house slippers stood in the morning air for a moment, and then, one by one, went home. 3 weeks later, Priscilla Favre filed the derivative action in Harwick County Circuit Court. The complaint named Darlene Whitmore personally and sought disgorgement of the $75,600 in Crestline payments plus legal fees. Darlene resigned from the HOA board 9 days after the filing. She did not deliver banana bread. The months that followed had the quality that good endings always have. Quieter than the crisis, better than you'd planned for, complicated in ways you didn't expect. The derivative action settled 8 months after filing. The HOA's insurance carrier, it turned out, had a policy covering board member liability, which meant that the disgorgement came partly from the policy and partly from a structured payment agreement that Darlene and her attorney negotiated. The Crestline payments were fully recovered, $75,600 back into the HOA maintenance reserve. The board also recovered the $14,800 from the special assessment, which was refunded to residents. Patsy's consulting company dissolved voluntarily 3 weeks after Darlene's resignation. Theron Jacobs and Ruth Ann Pickett led a reconstituted board through an emergency reserve fund audit. They brought in a licensed HOA management company, a real one, with references and a certified property manager, and established new conflict of interest disclosure requirements as a permanent bylaw amendment. Every future board member is required to sign a disclosure form at the start of their term and recuse from any vote where a financial relationship exists. It took one meeting to pass. The vote was unanimous. The Okafor family received a formal, written apology from the board for the pattern of enforcement irregularities they'd experienced. The apology was drafted by Ruth Ann personally. Mrs. Okafor told me later that she'd framed it, which she said with a laugh, that told me she was still deciding whether it was funny or necessary. Maybe both. The county ruled that the 1952 easement covenant was fully enforceable, that the HOA's petition attempt, which had never actually been formally filed, halted by the board vote and the injunction threat, would have triggered the liquidated damages clause. The county attorney's office issued a formal advisory to Meridian Freight Rail, confirming the crossing's protected status in perpetuity. Gerald Thorne sent me a copy with a note that read, "Well done, GT. Gerald is not effusive." The Tuesday run still runs. What I didn't expect, what genuinely surprised me, was what happened with the community afterward. Bert Kincaid organized a neighborhood meeting. Nothing official, just folding chairs in someone's garage. And people talked. Not about the HOA exactly, but about the years of it. The accumulated weight of the fines and the newsletters, and the feeling of being watched. The Moreau family talked about how isolated they'd felt when the new baby year coincided with the noise campaign. Mrs. Okafor talked about the basketball hoop. People listened. It was the kind of meeting that 11 years of petty governance had prevented from happening. Out of that garage meeting came something that nobody planned, a neighborhood fund. Informal at first, then formalized as the Ridgeline Pines Community Scholarship Fund, incorporated as a 501c3. The seed money, $2,000, collected from neighbors in $20 and $50 amounts, went to fund the first award, a $500 scholarship for a graduating senior at Harwick County High School, prioritized for students from the neighborhood. The Okafor's oldest daughter, who graduated that spring, applied. She received it. The fund has since grown. The crossing, which was supposed to be the symbol of everything wrong with this community, became the unlikely anchor of the story we told at the fund's first fundraiser. The locomotive stopped, the engineer stepped out, and the neighborhood found out it had more in common than it had been allowed to believe. I don't tell you this to make myself a hero. I was a guy who kept records and found a document in a county archive and had a good lawyer and got very lucky that the truth was actually legible. Most of the time, it isn't. But I'll tell you this, the smell of diesel on a Tuesday morning doesn't bother me anymore. It smells like winning, a little.
You know what stayed with me about Corbin's story? Not the moment on the tracks, not even the board meeting. It's the fact that he's been keeping reports for 11 years, quietly, not because he was planning anything, just because he's the kind of guy who pays attention. $75,000 out of that reserve fund, gone, and Dallas assumed nobody was watching closely enough to notice. She's been running that playbook for years. File enough complaints, make it expensive enough to fight back, and most people just stop. They absorb it. They move on. Corbin didn't stop. He didn't get loud about it either. He just kept reading the bylaws, kept showing up to meetings nobody else attended, kept one hand on that 1952 documents in the Cowie reports, and then one Tuesday morning in October, 11 years of patience pulled up to a railroad crossing. If you got an HOA situation of your own, doesn't have to be dramatic. Drop it in the comments. What they did, how you handle it, or maybe how you're still trying to figure out what to do. We read all of them. And if this channel has been useful to you, subscribing is the best way to stay with us. More story coming. Different stage, different board, same pattern. Carbon got his Tuesday mornings back. Most people don't realize they have the tools to do the same. We'll see you in the next one.